Can I just get like a verbal yes?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, cool. Um, yeah, so my presentation is going to be on Ashgar Fahardi's A Separation, specifically the first scene, the introduction when they're presenting their case to the judge. Um, so, just a quick synopsis. It's a 2011 film about this upper class Iranian couple, Samin and Nader. Samin wants to leave for Iran to make a better life for her daughter, but Nader refuses to leave his ailing father. And this forces Samin to leave him and seek a divorce, which they're doing in the opening scene. And then moving on to the parts that I'm going to focus on less. Nader hires Razia, who is pregnant, um, miscarries. Um, After what we think, he accuses her of theft. It leads to a lot of accusations and conflict. Her Razia's husband then sues, presses charges, and then in the very end, we find out that her miscarriage actually happened before the fight, um, and Nader was more or less innocent of the charges presented against him. Whether he was a good person is something that's more up for debate, and that was really the entire theme of the film. Was we don't know who is good and who is bad. It had a lot of Italian neo-realistic elements, especially on the working class side with Razia's family, moral dilemmas, really going away from the melodramas, political connotations of Iran at the time. They had just elected a new conservative president, and that was really encouraging a lot of more moderate and liberal Iranians to leave. Class dynamics. On one hand, here in this photo, you have Nader, who is very upper middle class, and then Razia, who is just scraping by. Um, and then you have some feminist elements with Samin wanting to leave. I think she's a great example of a feminist character. You also have family values because Nader, his core value is taking care of his father. That's a very important cultural responsibility in an intergenerational household. But then he has to also look at what's the best path forward for their daughter. So it creates a lot of gray areas. Um, and so going back to the scene selection, the introduction begins by scanning documents and then moves on to a head on lawn shot with arguments between Samin and Nader, with the judge overseeing their case. He cares much less about their case and has no time for fighting. It's a very stark contrast that you have these two very emotional people who we've just met, and then you have the judge who never appears on camera, just basically nodding his head and trying to get them out of their office. And then this scene is also really important because it circled back to in the conclusion when Terma decides which parent she's going to go with. And so I'll show you that scene now, hopefully. Please let me know if the audio doesn't come through. Otherwise, I'll just skip through it because it is just one long shot after the passports.
I don't
You can? Awesome.
I don't hear anything coming from it. I don't know.
Right now, it's just like a copier machine, so.
I
Okay.
used to say I can't hear it now.
Okay. Yeah, and the subtitles aren't coming through, so um I'll just click through then to show the key points for the sake of time. But it is a 3 minute long take in this room, which is really interesting because it makes mise en scène very, very important. And then you have top down, high key lighting. This is the still I chose. There are many like it, but this is my still. And what I mean by that is it's a 3 minute take, and this um, still can represent all those 3 minutes because um, the only changes are their body language. So what I really wanted to focus on was the mise en scène. The audio is a little important here. You hear the scanning, but other than that, it's mostly just dialogue, a little bit of background noise. Um, Nothing too important, but a couple of things I want to focus on first was how blank this back wall is. It's a neutral white. Um, I think that created a really cold feeling, kind of like the judge at the same time that you have these two very, very emotional, heated people. And then you have just a bureaucrat in a cold room who just wants to move on and have his coffee. So it's a very interesting introduction because this is our first time seeing them on screen apart from when they're getting the passport scans. So, what I think it does is it creates a another contrast um, that we see um, in when Nader is being prosecuted for the miscarriage because in those scenes they're even more emotional. The um, husband near gets arrested for contempt. There are lots of fights. They have to have policemen break it up. So this is a much more tepid introduction to the justice system and legal system of Iran. But what it does convey is that the choice is really in their hands, that the judge doesn't um, feel any one particular way. And I think that's a very intentional choice plot wise because um, if the judge was saying that Turma would have gone with Samin, I think the viewer would have already naturally been inclined to agree with the judge. But um, the viewer is literally in the judge's point of view, looking head on at Samin and Turga. So they're getting a very, very, very neutral impression. What does break up this scene is you have a few chairs in the background. I wouldn't really call it deep space composition. It's more of just there's something. So color wise, so their outfits do coordinate. They're on the darker side, which I do think is a bit symbolic, especially for Nader, but it's not the full on black they're wearing at the conclusion. You can tell from how Samin dresses, she is much more on the liberal European side. She has dyed hair. Her headscarf is pretty loose by Iranian standards. And then she's wearing neutral colors, which do kind of go with the room. Um, and yeah, the lighting, I think, has less of an impact. It does its job. You can see them looking head on. Um, and I think what really matters here beyond the mise en scène is the camera work, that you have a balanced shot, you have um, it's completely stabilized, I believe, from a tripod. So it's all in all just very, very neutral, which I think is the entire purpose of this scene. Is it gives you a very uncomfortable introduction. This is not how um, most movies introduce their two main characters, but at the same time, um, Farghadi does so in a way that when everything's changing and there's so much turmoil later on in the film, it's very hard for the viewer to pick one person over the other because it's all about the gray areas and lack of knowledge, lack of clarity. And that's what we get here is a lack of clarity as well because we're just thrust into this scene. I think the passport scanning scene kind of goes back to the neorealism and another couple of traits of Iranian cinema about how um, everything can be distilled down to basic bureaucratic elements that aren't particularly interesting but still send a message. And I think some of those messages are the local versus universal, that Samin has very unique and individual reasons for seeking a divorce and moving abroad, specifically Terma, but the desire for new opportunities and self betterment is a theme throughout human history. It's why the country that we are all in was founded. I think that's the broader message that they speak to universally. That in Iran, it was because of the president they had just elected, but in say Greece, someone might immigrate for more economic opportunities. Russia, it might be freedom of expression. So there's always a reason to leave um, and find a better life, but there's also always a reason to stay, as Nader shows with his father. And that's what makes him so emotional, we'll see in the scene. Where he's really leaning into his point about having to stay with his father out of that sense of obligation. And this is both kind of a local and a universal, that um, we all view family differently, but commitment to family is a pretty strong element in any case, really. So, yeah. And then to just move on into the course reflection, um, I found this course really interesting. Obviously, I had a pretty good background in the Middle East, um, and um, knew a lot about the region. So I didn't have any stereotypes there about the broader culture too much. But I think this was a much better introduction to Middle Eastern cinema than I had um, before previously, because for me, it was all about. Melodramas, these Egyptian and Saudi films that were all very dramatic, very loose plot lines. And that's what I loved about um, the Iranian cinema. That was very psychological, as we saw in a separation, that there was no moral clarity, there was no even definitive truth as we see throughout the film. Instead, it's all about perception, understanding, and um, just trying to make sense of a very confusing place, which I think is a another universal theme that Farghadi communicates quite well. Um, all of the films that I've watched from him, I've loved because there's no definitive base, and I think that's something I dislike about Hollywood and a lot of the movies that I've watched, that they just have a very simple rising action climax resolution. 99% of time, the good guy wins. And in this case, we had no idea who the good guy was or even what was truly going on. So I think that was probably my biggest takeaway from the class. And um, that is my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Mhm. Yeah. So, do you think with Farhadi's films and the way that they are so morally ambiguous makes it difficult for a viewer to find that universally relatable part?
I think that's a fair question, but I think it's actually it makes them even more relatable to people who have been through, deep, complex life challenges that, unlike some of the other films we watched, I think his films truly could have been set anywhere in the world because he focuses on these psychological elements, that it's not the streets of Tehran that define his films per se. It's the issues facing the people of Tehran that I think define, or any city in Iran, that really define his films. And yes, there are some cultural considerations, but I think all in all, they're pretty cosmopolitan. Um, Compared to, I would say the Turkish films were kind of the opposite of that, and they were um, very, very, very localized in a lot of cases. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Um, I don't think we did, because the ending was so unconclusive that I think it was pretty definitive the father died. because they're all wearing black. But beyond that, there was no right answer. Even Terma, who was in the film, couldn't decide on a right answer. So I think it really is in the eyes of the beholder, that the key universal takeaway is there's no one right answer or one solution to this problem or really any major problem in life, that you just have to do what you think is best and hope it works out, and sometimes it does. um, I think in Nodder's case, it obviously did not, because he thought he was doing what was right, but he still ended up in this whole situation um, later on in the film. So, sorry if that doesn't really answer your question, but it's so it's so loose, but um, really complex at the same time. So, yeah. Yay, we're done.
Okay.